Imagine sitting across from another person whose life has silently diverged from yours. The distance between two strangers can feel like an ocean unless someone decides to understand what the other has weathered. This is the simple beginning of a profound story about empathy, and it begins with curiosity and courage. Empathy often gets confused with sympathy because both look like concern from the outside. Sympathy leans away and offers comfort from the margins, while empathy leans in and tries to enter the other's inner world with careful attention. Understanding this distinction frames everything that follows in our exploration of moral thought and human connection. Philosophers have argued about empathy for centuries without always using the same words or categories. Some named it moral imagination, others called it the capacity to simulate another's feelings in our minds, and a few described it as a bridge between solitary consciousnesses. Tracing those labels helps us see how empathy became a pillar of modern ethical discussion. Modern psychology splits empathy into cognitive and affective components to explain how people understand and feel for others. Cognitive empathy is the mental act of imagining another's perspective, while affective empathy is a felt resonance with another person's emotions. Recognizing these different pathways helps explain why someone might understand a pain without actually feeling it themselves. Neuroscience has added surprising evidence to our philosophical debates about empathy by revealing how brains mirror and simulate. Mirror neurons and network activity light up when people observe others in pain, suggesting a biological substrate for shared experience. Still, the brain does not tell the whole moral story, because knowing a mechanism does not settle how we should respond. If empathy is a kind of moral perception, then it must play a role in ethical reasoning and judgment. Many moral philosophers have argued that empathy is the soil where prosocial instincts grow, and that it motivates acts of justice and generosity. Yet, philosophers have also warned that unfiltered empathy can distort our moral compass if it remains parochial or selective. One classic puzzle shows empathy's double edge. We may feel more for a single identifiable victim than for distant millions. This identifiable victim effect reveals a psychological bias where emotion overrides impartial moral reasoning in ways that can mislead ethical choices. Understanding this bias forces us to think about systems that channel empathy toward fairer outcomes rather than leaving it to chance. Empathy is not merely a private emotional skill, but a civic practice that shapes how societies treat each other. When leaders and institutions cultivate perspective-taking, policy can become more humane and more effective at addressing suffering. Conversely, societies that discourage understanding tend to fragment into suspicion and punitive policies. Developing empathy is simultaneously the simplest and hardest moral task we face, and the methods are surprisingly practical. Active listening, sustained attention, and honest questions begin the work of entering another person's world without pretending to own it. Rehearsing small acts of perspective, taking in everyday conversations slowly builds the habit of empathetic thought. Literature and storytelling are powerful training grounds for empathy because they invite readers to live inside another consciousness. When we read a novel, the repeated practice of inhabiting a character's interior life strengthens neural pathways for understanding others. That is why teachers and thinkers have for centuries recommended reading as a moral exercise as much as an intellectual one. Travel and exposure to different cultures also expand empathetic capacities by breaking habitual frames of reference. Immersion in unfamiliar social worlds forces us to reinterpret gestures, norms, and emotions outside our usual assumptions. The uncomfortable moments of miscommunication during travel are often the most fertile for deepening understanding. But empathy has limits that are moral and practical, and acknowledging them is not defeat but wisdom. Empathy can be selective, fierce for those close to us and thin for strangers, and that parochial pull can institutionalize injustice if we mistake feeling for fairness. Recognizing these limits helps us design moral rules and systems that compensate for empathy's blind spots. Empathic distress and burnout show that feeling too much can be self-defeating for caregivers and activists. When emotional resonance becomes overwhelming without regulation, people withdraw or become numb to further suffering, which undermines long-term moral engagement. Learning emotional boundaries and compassionate practices, therefore, becomes crucial for sustainable empathy. There is also a moral danger when empathy is used instrumentally to manipulate rather than to understand. Skilled persuaders can exploit empathic cues to sway opinions or mask selfish motives, which turns a noble capacity into a tool of power. Ethical empathy requires honesty and reciprocity, not clever mimicry employed for cynical ends. Turning to ancient wisdom, Buddhist thought makes a nuanced distinction between empathy and compassion that sharpens our modern debates. Empathy in Buddhist contexts often refers to feeling another's suffering, while compassion is directed action motivated by the wish to relieve that suffering. This distinction reframes empathy as a motivation that needs ethical refinement through skillful action. Buddhist practices teach not only feeling for others, but cultivating equanimity so that compassion remains stable and effective. Through practices like loving kindness meditation, practitioners develop a steady heart that can feel widely without collapsing into empathic fatigue. This ancient technology of the mind gives us a model for balancing feeling with durable moral intention. The relationship between empathy and wisdom is subtle because empathy gives us material that wisdom must shape. Wisdom interprets felt understanding through context, long-term consequences, and principles that prevent partiality. When empathy is guided by reflective judgment, it becomes a force for justice rather than a mere tide of feeling. Practical wisdom asks questions about scale, fairness, and sustainability that raw empathy cannot answer alone. For example, feeling deep sorrow for one family's plight must not blind policymakers to solutions that benefit entire communities. Wise empathy, therefore, translates particular feelings into principles that can be applied broadly and fairly. Empathy also has a crucial role in conflict transformation because understanding an opponent's narrative can diffuse hostility. When adversaries recognize each other's pain and intentions, opportunities for negotiated settlements and reconciliation multiply. That does not guarantee harmony, but it changes the terms of engagement in ways that make peace possible. In education, teaching perspective-taking improves both learning outcomes and social cohesion among students. Classrooms that encourage role play, literature discussions, and dialogical listening nurture habits of attention that students carry into adulthood. These pedagogical practices are investments in a citizenry capable of understanding complexity rather than reacting simplistically. At work, empathetic leadership builds trust and creative collaboration, and it also requires institutional scaffolding. Organizations can train managers to listen, provide psychological safety, and design feedback systems that reward perspective taking. These structural supports prevent empathy from becoming an individual burden and instead make it an organizational advantage. In intimate relationships, empathy functions as the currency of mutual recognition and growth over time. Couples who practice reflective listening and share vulnerability develop resilience against loneliness and resentment. Empathy in this close register is less about dramatic gestures and more about repeated small acts of validation and curiosity. Practical exercises can expand empathetic skill in measurable ways if they are practiced with discipline and humility. Simple daily habits like asking open questions, reflecting back what you heard and pausing before reacting cultivate deeper attentiveness over weeks. These micro practices accumulate into a sustained capacity to act compassionately under pressure. Empathy can also be cultivated through media choices that diversify the perspectives we absorb into our imaginations. Documentaries, podcasts, and long-form journalism that center marginalized voices force listeners to confront unfamiliar life worlds. Consuming such media deliberately shapes our emotional repertoire and makes our moral intuitions more inclusive. Yet we must remember that empathy without accountability can become sentimental and hollow in public life. Good intentions do not automatically translate into effective policy or reparative action, and sometimes they obscure structural realities that require systemic change. A mature empathy acknowledges institutional responsibility alongside individual compassion. There are political strategies to channel empathy productively without becoming manipulative or chaotic. Deliberative forums, restorative justice programs, and community exchanges create spaces where stories are heard and translated into public goods. These civic technologies harness empathy as an organizing principle rather than leaving it to performative spectacle. Ultimately, empathy is a capacity that transforms how we experience persons as ends rather than means in our moral universe. When we consistently seek to understand others, we alter the incentives that shape politeness, policy, and institutions. That transformation is gradual but irreversible when cultivated sincerely and systematically. The philosophical twist is that empathy is at once personal practice and public technology for living well together. It cannot solve every moral problem, and it must be governed by wisdom, institutional design, and ethical reflection. But practiced well, empathy becomes the root of societies that can respond to suffering with justice and imagination. If this episode has given you a new way to look at other people, then consider one small experiment you can try today. Ask someone a careful question. Listen without planning your answer, and see what new understanding emerges from that honest silence. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and let us keep practicing the work of understanding others together.